All right, so as I mentioned earlier, insects eat just about anything. They'll eat animal matter, meats and stuff. They're plant eaters. They cause a tremendous amount of damage to agriculture, and as well as your home garden, or if you plant tomatoes or peppers or celery and stuff like that. Some are both plant and animal eaters, and some only feast on organic matter and so forth. And then they're also involved in consuming or cleaning up decayed matter and so forth. Can you imagine, a dead carcass? There'll be flies on that within hours, and then there are beetles and so forth that'll clean all the meat off of it right down to the bone. In fact, it's a technique that's often used. How many have ever heard of rearticulation of a skeleton? What is it?
When they take all the bones and they restructure it like they do for living.
Exactly. So how do they get those bones so nice and clean? They put them in we call it an arena. They put it in an arena with a bunch of flesh-eating scarabs. How many saw the movie The Mummy? When they wrapped that guy up and they put him in and they dumped all those bugs in there? Okay, those bugs will live in there for as long as there's food. In the meantime, they consume all the stuff. Well, anyway, they clean it all down to the bone. You got a nice clean bone, no meat on it, and so forth. Then you can work with the skeletons. And I think if you go to the Field Museum, they probably have one of those in operation there. So, okay, next slide. All right, let's do some anatomy and physiology. Okay, that's really what I think is interesting. Typical body plan of an insect is the head, thorax, and abdomen. On the head, you're going to find mouth parts and antennae. Antennae are sensory organs. On the thorax, that's where the legs and the wings are associated. Okay? How many legs does an insect have? If I said insects are called hexapods, would that be correct? Hexa means 6. Poda, feet. Okay, so hexapoda, 6 feet. That she carries around with her and so forth. The difference is the abdomen and the thorax in arachnids is fused. Okay, and then the head is separate. How many eyes does a spider have? Okay, next slide. All right, so when we talk about arthropods, that's the largest group in the animal kingdom. We've got a segmented body. It's paired appendages. And obviously, if you notice paired appendages, it must have bilateral symmetry. Bi means what? 2. Lateral means what? Sides. So bilateral, 2 sides. If you split it down the middle, you have mirror images. Okay? All right, they have an exoskeleton. The exoskeleton, the primary structure there is chitin, and I'll show you that in just a minute. This is a nitrogenous polysaccharide, much like cellulose with side chains of nitrogenous compounds. They have an open circulatory system. Now, what that means is they do have a blood vessel. It's called a dorsal aorta. And it's just a big, long tube that's got some muscle on it that can squeeze, and it circulates their blood, which is called hemolymph, circulates the blood from the tail end of the organism up towards the head end of the organism, and then it just kind of moves to the back again. In doing that, the hemolymph comes in contact with all the internal tissues. Okay? All right, Malpighian tubules. This is an interesting structure. It's analogous to our kidney. It's involved with water regulation, ion transport, and things like that. And that's how they regulate the internal environment and keep it in homeostasis. All right? As far as respiration is concerned, again, they don't have lungs, but they do ventilate air. And it comes through a network of tubes, and they can control the opening and closing of those tubes with a structure called a spiracle. Okay? And now I said they don't have blood vessels per se, and they don't have a system like we do in terms of lungs. So how do they get oxygen to all the tissues? And also, How do they get rid of carbon dioxide from the tissues? Anybody know? How do the spiracles work? Actually, just movement will cause the air to flow through the spiracles and down the tracheas and the tracheoles. Okay, but how does the oxygen get from there to the tissues? It's not carried on a blood cell. They have cells, blood cells, but they're involved with immunology. They're not involved with oxygen transport. So how does the oxygen get to the tissues? All right, stump the students. You all know the answer, I'm sure of it. Have you ever heard of diffusion? The distance is so small that they can facilitate gas exchange by mere diffusion. They don't need a carrier protein. They don't need cells or anything like that. Oxygen diffuses in, carbon dioxide diffuses out. Simple, right? All right, cool stuff. The fat body is a structure that's analogous to our liver. It undergoes a lot of metabolic processes. It's also involved with immunity. So it's an important structure. And then, like I said, the blood is called hemolymph, and the types of cells that are found in the hemolymph is called hemocytes. Okay? Cyto meaning cell. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk a little bit more specifically. The integumentary system and the skeletal system together create a covering. Now, one of the biggest problems insects have is drying out. They dry out very easily. In fact, oftentimes, if an insect's external covering becomes damaged in some way or another, they die of dehydration or infection, but they have a very robust immune system. But generally, they try to prevent losing water. So water conservation is really important to them. Nervous system, their nervous system isn't that much different than ours. Ours runs down the dorsal aspect of our body, which is down our back. Theirs runs down the belly side or the ventral side. And there's a glandular system as well. When we think of glandular system, usually we think of hormones and stuff like that. Well, that's true of insects, but they also produce pheromones from that. In the case of like the silkworm moth, they produce silk from a gland and so forth. So the glandular system is really important as well. Muscular system kind of goes without saying. They can move. The muscles are attached on the inside of the exoskeleton, unlike ours, where the muscles are attached on the outside of the exoskeleton, or the endoskeleton. The alimentary canal includes the digestive tract, and that's pretty simple. It's a tube that runs through our body and absorbs nutrients. The Malpighian tubules are associated with that as well, because they also can produce urine. And then the respiratory system, we talked about that with the spiracles and the tracheae and so forth. Next slide. All right, let me talk about the exoskeleton for just a second. How many have seen any of those movies where you got these giant bugs or the giant spider? Okay, let me tell you why that can't exist. Next slide, please. One more. This is the molecular structure of chitin. As you can see, it looks like a sugar. It is a cellulose sugar. And it has these nitrogenous side chains on it and so forth. This molecule is really heavy in molecular terms. Okay, so if a bug was really, really big, that exoskeleton would be extremely heavy. And it would have to have huge muscles to lift that and move it around. And in doing so, it becomes ineffective. It would consume so much energy. Those muscles would heat up. It'd have to control its body temperature. If it lived in a hot area and so forth, it would heat up and die. So it's really, impractical. And insects are very practical creatures. Next slide, please. Antennae. There's a variety of different antennae. These are one of the ways that they sense their external environment. Okay, next slide. Legs. Again, a lot of times the type of habitat that they live in is determined by the kinds of legs that they use in that habitat for like digging, swimming, grasping, and so forth. Next slide. All right, as far as the internal anatomy goes, we can see here there's some of the main structures. The blue tube that runs across the top is the dorsal aorta, and that's where blood is circulated. The center tube that runs from head to tail is the digestive tract, And then down below is a two-lobed brain, and then it runs ventrally, and it has these little clusters of cells called ganglia. And ganglia will control certain groups of muscles and so forth for like walking and flying and so forth. Next slide. All right, so the digestive system is divided into three sections: the foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut. In the foregut, that's where the food is processed. Oftentimes, insects will take in particulate like sand or gravel, very, very small sand or gravel and so forth, and that acts as the grinding agent to grind up the food. And the idea behind that is so that they can take large chunks and break it down into small chunks. And then by increasing the surface area of the food, then you can have a more efficient action of enzymes to further digest it. Okay? So in the midgut is where all that absorption of those nutrients occurs. That's where the enzymes are introduced. That's where the food is broken down into the simplest components that it can then be absorbed into the tissues. The hindgut, of course, is where the waste is produced, and also the balance of water is done there, very much like what we do, and so forth. And insect poop is called, anybody know? Frass. Everybody say that. Frass. Okay, now don't get in trouble with that word, okay? Because I know some of you guys. All right, next slide, please. Now, I talked about the circulatory system, these aortic pumps. They say sometimes an insect has 10 hearts. Well, they're just clusters of muscle that help circulate. And it's a one-way pumping system. It has valves in it that are one-way. And so hemolymph then circulates from the tail end towards the front end, and then it just sort of bathes the rest of the tissues in hemolymph. Next slide, please. I mentioned the brain and the nervous system. It's a two-lobed brain, as you can see at the head end of this drawing, and then the ventral nerve cord runs along the belly side, and then we have these bundles of nerves, which are called ganglia. Next slide. All right, then there's metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is really a cool thing. There's two kinds. There's one that's an incomplete metamorphosis, and that's where the nymphs gradually go through changes with molting. And as they do that, they become more and more mature until they get to the adult stage then, where they appear as we normally think of adults appearing. The telltale sign is wings. Nymphs don't have wings that are functional. Adults do. Okay, next one. And then there's complete metamorphosis, which I'm sure you're all familiar with if you've ever watched butterflies and moths and stuff. But generally, you've got nymphal stages, and then an incomplete metamorphosis is on the right, complete metamorphosis on the left. And again, the nymphal stages don't have wings that are functional, but the adults do. That's the telltale sign of that.